The year is 332 before Christ. The most powerful military force the world has ever seen stands on the shores of the Levantine coast, staring at what appears to be an impossible challenge. Alexander of Macedon, 24 years old, has conquered every army that dared face him in open battle. His phalanx is undefeated. His cavalry is unstoppable. Kings and emperors have bowed before him. But now, half a mile across the azure waters of the Mediterranean, rises a fortress that has never fallen to any conqueror in its entire history. Tyre. The island city stands defiant, its massive stone walls reaching 45 meters into the sky, higher than any siege tower ever built. The Tyrians look down from their impregnable fortifications and laugh at the young Macedonian king. They send their ambassadors with a message dripping with arrogance. Tyre acknowledges Alexander as a great conqueror, but they will not open their gates. They will not submit. They are protected by the sea itself, and no land army, no matter how powerful, can touch them. Alexander's generals advise him to move on. The siege of an island fortress could take years. The Persian Empire awaits. Egypt lies to the south, ripe for conquest. Why waste time on one stubborn city? But Alexander sees what his generals do not. Tyre controls the most powerful naval fleet in the Mediterranean. As long as Tyre remains free, the Persian Navy has a base of operations. As long as Tyre stands unconquered, every other city will believe they too can resist. This is not just about one city. This is about sending a message that will echo across continents. Alexander makes a decision that will change the course of history and demonstrate the terrifying power of human determination against impossible odds. He will build a road across the sea. If you want to witness one of the most extraordinary military campaigns ever conducted, one that combined engineering genius with brutal warfare, hit that subscribe button and activate notifications. This is a story of 7 months that tested the limits of ancient warfare. The question is not whether Tyre would fall. The question is, what price would be paid in blood, stone, and fire to make it happen? To understand why Alexander stood on that beach willing to attempt the impossible, we need to go back and comprehend what Tyre represented in the ancient world. Tyre was not just another city. For over 2,000 years, this Phoenician metropolis had dominated Mediterranean trade. The Phoenicians were the greatest sailors and merchants of the ancient world, and Tyre was their crown jewel. The purple dye produced in Tyre, extracted from thousands of murex sea snails, clothed emperors and kings across 3 continents. Tyrian glass was unmatched in quality. Their ships sailed to the edges of the known world, establishing colonies from North Africa to Spain. Carthage itself, the future rival of Rome, was founded by Tyrian colonists. The city existed in 2 parts. Old Tyre sat on the mainland, a settlement that had been abandoned and partially destroyed over the centuries of warfare. But New Tyre, the real power, had been built on a rocky island approximately 800 meters from the shore. This was no small fishing village. The island stretched over 140 hectares, home to 40,000 people packed into one of the most densely populated urban centers of the ancient world. The fortifications were legendary. Walls of solid stone rose from the very edge of the island, built directly on the rocks where waves crashed against them. These were not simple barriers. They were massive constructions, 45 meters high on the landward side, thick enough that chariots could race along the top. Towers studded the walls at regular intervals, providing platforms for archers and artillery. The Tyrians had spent centuries and fortunes perfecting these defenses, believing with absolute conviction that their city could never be taken by force. They had good reason for this confidence. No army in history had successfully besieged an island fortress of this magnitude. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, one of the most powerful rulers of the age, had tried to conquer Tyre. He laid siege to the city for 13 years, from 585 to 572 before Christ. 13 years of blockade, of attempted assaults, of starvation tactics, and Tyre never fell. Nebuchadnezzar eventually gave up and withdrew, accepting a face-saving compromise. The Tyrians remembered this. They knew their walls, their fleet, and their island position made them untouchable. But the world had changed since Nebuchadnezzar's time. A new power had risen in the north that would reshape the ancient world. Macedon, a kingdom dismissed as barbarian by the sophisticated Greeks, had been transformed by one man into the most efficient military machine ever created. Philip II had taken a collection of feuding tribes and forged them into a professional army. He created the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of men armed with sarissas, pikes 18 feet long, that could break any enemy line. He trained the companion cavalry, heavy horsemen who could shatter enemy flanks. And then he died, assassinated at a wedding feast, leaving his 20-year-old son to inherit an army hungry for conquest. Alexander was not supposed to succeed. He was young, untested, surrounded by enemies. The Greek city-states rebelled the moment Philip died. Tribes to the north saw opportunity in a boy king. But Alexander moved with shocking speed. He crushed the Thracian rebellion in weeks. He burned Thebes to the ground as a message to the Greeks. And then he turned east toward the Persian Empire, fulfilling his father's dream of revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece. In 334 before Christ, Alexander crossed into Asia with 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. At the Granicus River, he shattered the Persian forces in Asia Minor. At Issus, in 333 before Christ, he defeated Darius III, the great king himself, in a battle that should have been impossible to win. Darius fled, abandoning his mother, his wife, and his children to the Macedonian conqueror. By 332 before Christ, Alexander controlled the entire Anatolian peninsula. The Persian fleet, however, remained a threat. As long as Persia controlled the seas, they could strike at Greece, cut Alexander's supply lines, and support rebellions in his rear. Alexander understood naval warfare, even though Macedon had virtually no ships. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity: conquer every port on the Mediterranean coast. A fleet without harbors is useless. Most cities submitted immediately. Sidon opened its gates. Byblos surrendered without resistance. These Phoenician cities had no loyalty to Persia, which ruled them as an occupying power. But Tyre was different. Tyre had maintained semi-independence even under Persian rule. Their fleet was their own. Their wealth was their own. They had survived Babylonian sieges and Egyptian invasions. They saw no reason to fear a Macedonian boy, no matter how many battles he had won on land. When Alexander arrived at Tyre in January of 332 before Christ, he did not come as an enemy. He came offering partnership. He sent ambassadors requesting permission to enter the city and sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the Phoenician god whom Greeks identified with Heracles. This was diplomatic language. Alexander claimed descent from Heracles. The right to sacrifice in Tyre's temple would symbolize Tyrian acceptance of his authority. The Tyrians understood the game. They sent back a counteroffer. Alexander could sacrifice at the temple of Old Tyre on the mainland, but not on the island. They would acknowledge him as a great king, would provide supplies and tribute, but they would not open their gates to his army. It was a calculated insult. The Tyrians were telling Alexander that while they respected his power, they did not fear it. Their walls and their sea protected them. The young conqueror could rage all he wanted on the beach. He could not touch them. Alexander's response would define him as one of history's most determined commanders. He called his officers together and delivered a speech that ancient historians recorded. The Persian fleet operates from Tyre, he told them. While Tyre stands free, our rear is threatened. We cannot march into Egypt, cannot pursue Darius into Mesopotamia. While a hostile fleet controls the sea behind us, Tyre must fall. His engineers must have thought he was insane. How do you besiege an island without ships? Alexander had an answer. If Tyre was an island, he would make it part of the mainland. Alexander's plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would build a causeway, a massive mole of earth and stone, directly across the channel separating the mainland from the island fortress. 800 meters of open water would be filled with debris until his army could march dry-footed to the walls of Tyre. No one had ever attempted such a project. The engineering challenges were staggering. The channel was not shallow. Near the shore, the water was perhaps 6 feet deep, manageable for construction. But halfway across, the seabed dropped to 18 feet, then deeper. Currents swept through the strait, powerful enough to wash away anything not firmly anchored. Winter storms could destroy months of work in a single night, and all of this would have to be accomplished while defenders rained arrows, javelins, and stones from the walls. Alexander gave the order anyway. The Macedonian army, the most feared fighting force in the world, became a construction crew. The work began immediately. Alexander needed materials, massive quantities of materials. The ruins of old Tyre on the mainland provided the first resources. Buildings that had stood for centuries were torn down stone by stone. Everything usable was dragged to the shore and dumped into the water. But the ruins of one abandoned town were not nearly enough for a project of this scale. Alexander sent logging teams into the mountains of Lebanon. The famous cedars of Lebanon, trees that had provided timber for Solomon's temple 500 years earlier, were cut down by the thousands. These massive trunks, some over 100 feet long, were dragged to the coast by oxen teams and used as the framework for the mole. The logs were driven into the seabed vertically to create a foundation, then horizontal timbers were laid across them. Between this wooden framework, everything imaginable was dumped: stones, rubble, earth, sand. 30,000 men worked on the construction. Macedonian infantry, Syrian laborers, conscripts from conquered cities, all working under the Mediterranean sun. The mole began to take shape, a growing tongue of land reaching out toward the island. Alexander worked alongside his men, carrying stones, directing placement, driving the project forward through sheer force of will. The Tyrians watched from their walls with amusement. Their fishermen sailed around the growing causeway, shouting insults at the workers. Tyrian citizens gathered on the ramparts to mock the efforts of the world's greatest conqueror, reduced to hauling rocks. They could not believe Alexander was serious. The project would take years, perhaps decades. No army could maintain a siege that long. Eventually, he would give up, just as Nebuchadnezzar had given up, and Tyre would stand triumphant. But as weeks passed and the mole continued to grow, the laughter began to die. The Macedonians were not giving up. The causeway was now 100 meters long, then 200. Workers were organized into shifts, construction continuing day and night by torchlight. Alexander had established supply lines from the entire region, bringing in materials from 50 miles around. The Tyrians decided mockery was no longer sufficient. Their warships began harassing the construction crews. Fast galleys would sweep in close to shore, archers standing in the prows, releasing volleys of arrows into the packed workers. Men would scream and fall into the water, their bodies swept away by the current. The ships would vanish before any response could be organized. Alexander responded by posting units of archers and javelin throwers along the length of the mole. Shields were erected to provide cover for the workers, but missiles fired from ships were only part of the problem. The real danger came from beneath the surface. Tyrian divers, men who had spent their entire lives in these waters, began sabotaging the construction. They would swim out at night with ropes and hooks, attaching them to the wooden pilings that formed the foundation of the mole. Then their ships would pull, attempting to yank the supports free. Sometimes they succeeded, and entire sections of the causeway would collapse into the sea, washing away a week's worth of labor in minutes. Alexander ordered the construction of dolphins, large wooden beams tipped with metal spikes that hung from the edge of the mole. When divers approached, these would be dropped, attempting to impale them underwater. It became a deadly game, invisible warfare beneath the waves. As the mole advanced into deeper water, the pace of construction slowed. Dumping rubble into 18 feet of water required far more material than filling 6-foot shallows. Currents were stronger in the deeper channel, washing away loose material before it could settle. Alexander's engineers had to sink larger foundation stones first, creating a base that could resist the currents before filling in around them. The mole's width was approximately 60 meters, wide enough for siege engines and troop formations. The sides were reinforced with the largest stones available, creating retaining walls to prevent erosion. But despite all precautions, storms would regularly damage the structure. After one particularly violent winter squall, the Macedonians woke to find 30 meters of the mole's end had simply vanished, swept away by waves. Alexander refused to show frustration. He ordered the damage repaired and construction to continue. His men began to understand that their king would not abandon this siege. He would build this causeway if it took years. He would reach Tyre's walls if he had to fill the entire strait with stones. By the end of the second month, the mole had reached the halfway point. 400 meters of causeway now connected the shore to empty sea. And at the end of this growing peninsula, Alexander ordered the construction of 2 siege towers. These were not simple wooden structures. These towers were engineering marvels, rising 40 meters high, taller than anything the Tyrians had seen before. Built on the widest part of the mole, they were constructed of heavy timber, protected on 3 sides by hides soaked in vinegar to prevent fire. Each tower had multiple levels, equipped with catapults and ballistae, artillery pieces that could hurl stones and bolts with devastating force. The purpose was clear. As the mole advanced, these towers would provide covering fire, suppressing the Tyrian defenders on the walls. Archers and artillerists positioned in the towers could strike at the ramparts, making it dangerous for Tyrians to even show themselves. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. The towers announced that Alexander was not just building a road, he was bringing his siege weapons within range. The Tyrians understood they had underestimated their enemy. This was not going to be a failed attempt that would collapse from logistical difficulties. The Macedonians were actually going to reach the island. The situation required a dramatic response. The Tyrian council met in emergency session. Their naval superiority had not been fully utilized. Their ships had harassed the construction, but harassment was not enough. They needed to destroy the causeway, obliterate it so completely that rebuilding would be impossible. They needed to break Alexander's will. The Tyrians conceived a plan of terrible brilliance. They would create a fire ship, but not an ordinary one. They would build a floating inferno that would consume the Macedonian towers and send a message of flame visible for miles. An old transport vessel was selected, a ship past its useful life. The hold was filled with dry wood, cedar chips, anything that would burn intensely. Pots of sulfur and pitch were loaded aboard, along with amphorae of oil. The entire ship was transformed into a floating bomb. Most ingeniously, the bow was weighted with stones and sand, tilting it forward so that when it struck the mole, the bow would rise and the burning materials would pour out onto the target. On a moonless night in late March, the Tyrians launched their weapon. Sailors guided the fire ship out of the harbor under oars, absolute silence maintained until they were close to the mole. Then, when they were within 200 meters of the towers, they lit the fire. The flames erupted with horrific speed. The ship became a blazing comet crossing the dark water. Tyrian galleys rowed alongside, using poles to keep the fire ship on course, directly toward the 2 massive towers at the end of the causeway. Macedonian sentries shouted warnings, but there was nothing they could do. The fire ship struck the mole with a grinding crash, and the bow tilted up exactly as designed, pouring burning oil and sulfur across the wooden platforms. The siege towers, these symbols of Macedonian ingenuity and determination, became funeral pyres. The fire spread faster than men could react. Soldiers trapped on the upper levels had seconds to decide: burn or jump into the sea. Many chose the water and drowned in their armor. Those who stayed burned alive. The roar of flames was joined by the screams of dying men. Tyrian warships moved in immediately behind the fire ship. With the defenders distracted by the inferno, they launched a coordinated assault on the mole itself. Grappling hooks attached to the wooden framework. Ships pulled with all the force their rowers could generate. Weakened by fire, sections of the causeway began to tear away. Macedonian soldiers rushed to defend what remained, but in the darkness and chaos, they were easy targets for Tyrian archers. By dawn, the damage was catastrophic. Both siege towers were gone, reduced to charred skeletons that collapsed into the sea. The final 100 meters of the mole had been torn apart, months of work destroyed in a single night. Bodies floated in the water, Macedonian soldiers who had drowned or burned. The Tyrians celebrated on their walls, certain they had broken the siege. Alexander stood on the beach and watched the smoke rise from his ruined causeway. His generals waited for the order to withdraw, to abandon this impossible siege and continue the march south. Any reasonable commander would have recognized defeat and moved on. Alexander's response stunned everyone. "Rebuild it," he ordered. "Make it wider, make it stronger, and bring me ships." If Tyre wanted naval warfare, he would give them naval warfare. The fireship attack had revealed a fundamental problem with Alexander's strategy. Without naval power, the causeway would always be vulnerable. The Tyrians controlled the sea completely. Their warships could strike whenever they chose, and the Macedonians could do nothing but watch. Every night became a potential disaster. Every completed section of the mole could be torn apart before morning. Alexander needed ships, and Macedon had virtually none. The kingdom that had conquered the greatest empire on earth had no naval tradition. Philip II had never bothered building a fleet. Why invest in ships when the phalanx was undefeated on land? But now Alexander faced an enemy his phalanx could not reach. Protected by water, his cavalry could not cross. The solution required diplomacy as much as military force. The Phoenician cities that had already submitted to Alexander were maritime powers. Sidon, Byblos, Arados, all possessed warships and skilled sailors. But these cities had remained neutral in the siege, unwilling to attack their sister city Tyre. They provided supplies to Alexander's army, honored their treaties, but they would not commit their fleets against fellow Phoenicians. Alexander sent envoys to these cities with a simple message. The Persian Empire was collapsing. Darius had been defeated twice and fled both times. The great king who claimed to rule from the Mediterranean to India had proven himself a coward. The old order was finished. A new power controlled the region, and that power demanded a choice: stand with Macedon or be treated as enemies. The argument was compelling because it was true. Persian authority in the region had evaporated. The satraps and governors who once enforced the great king's will were dead or in flight. No Persian army remained between Alexander and Egypt. The Phoenician cities recognized reality. One by one, they committed their fleets to Alexander's service. Ships began arriving at the Macedonian camp in early April. 80 warships from Sidon, 10 from Arados, another 10 from Byblos. These were triremes and kinkuremes, the most advanced warships of the age, powered by multiple banks of oars and equipped with bronze rams designed to punch through enemy hulls. Their crews were professionals, men who had spent their lives at sea. Then came an even more significant addition. The kings of Cyprus, the large island to the north, had been watching the siege with great interest. Cyprus was technically subject to Persia, but that allegiance meant nothing anymore. The Cypriot kings saw opportunity. If they joined Alexander now, they would be allies of the conqueror. If they waited and he won anyway, they would be conquered subjects. 120 Cypriot warships sailed south to join the growing fleet. By mid-April, Alexander commanded over 200 warships. The naval balance had completely reversed. The Tyrians, who had ruled these waters for centuries, suddenly faced a fleet that outnumbered them more than 2-to-1. The Tyrian admirals understood the implications immediately. Their entire defensive strategy had relied on naval superiority. The fireship attack had worked because Macedonian positions were vulnerable to assault from the sea. But now the sea itself was contested. Tyrian ships could no longer operate freely. Every sortie risked encountering overwhelming enemy numbers. The Tyrian fleet withdrew into the harbor, conceding control of the open water. It was a devastating psychological blow. For the first time in their history, the Tyrians were blockaded in their own city. The island that had always been supplied by sea was now cut off. Alexander ordered the Phoenician fleet to patrol the northern harbor approaches, while the Cypriots covered the southern side. Nothing would enter or leave Tyre without his permission. But Alexander understood that ships alone would not win the siege. The causeway had to be completed, and it had to be protected from any further attacks. The reconstruction began with new specifications. The mole would now be built wider at the base, over 100 meters across in some sections, narrowing to 60 meters at the top. This width would make it far more stable, resistant to both storms and sabotage. More importantly, the entire construction would be protected. Alexander ordered the building of protective barriers along both sides of the mole. These were screens of wood and hide that could stop arrows and provide cover for workers. Catapults were positioned at intervals, ready to fire at any approaching ship. The causeway was transforming from a simple pathway into a fortified position. The pace of work increased dramatically. With the Tyrian fleet neutralized, harassment from the sea had ended. Workers could labor without constantly watching for attacking warships. Divers no longer sabotaged the pilings, because Macedonian ships patrolled the waters around the construction site. Materials flowed in from across the region. Forests in Lebanon were stripped bare. Quarries worked day and night providing stone. Every conquered city contributed laborers and supplies. The mole grew steadily toward the island. 600 meters, then 700. The gap was closing. On the Tyrian walls, defenders watched the causeway approach with growing dread. The impossible was becoming reality. The sea that had protected them for millennia was being conquered by human determination and engineering. The Tyrians attempted one final naval gambit. Their warships could not break the blockade, but perhaps they could still damage the Macedonian fleet. On a day when strong winds were blowing from the north, Tyrian captains noticed that many of the Cypriot ships guarding the southern harbor had been drawn northward, leaving a gap in the coverage. 13 of Tyre's best warships, quinqueremes crewed by elite sailors, made a sudden sortie. They emerged from the harbor at maximum speed, rams pointed at the scattered Cypriot vessels. The attack achieved complete surprise. 3 Cypriot ships were rammed and sunk before they could even deploy their oars. 2 more were driven onto the rocks and wrecked. It was a tactical victory, a demonstration that Tyrian naval skill remained formidable. The crews returned to cheers from the walls, having struck a blow against the besiegers. But strategically, the attack changed nothing. 5 ships sunk out of a fleet of 200 was insignificant. The blockade remained intact, and Alexander's response was swift and brutal. He ordered an immediate assault on the Tyrian ships in the harbor. Macedonian and Phoenician warships moved in, attempting to force their way past the harbor defenses. The goal was not to capture the port, but to sink the Tyrian fleet at anchor, eliminating the naval threat entirely. Tyrian defenders on the harbor walls fired catapults and arrows, supporting their ships. The sea battle raged for hours, quinqueremes ramming each other, marines boarding enemy vessels, fire and blood spreading across the water. The Tyrians managed to protect their harbor, driving back the assault, but only barely. They lost additional ships in the fighting. More importantly, they recognized that any further sorties would result in the complete destruction of their fleet. The remaining Tyrian warships were pulled back into the inner harbor and secured. They would not venture out again. Tyre was now completely isolated. No supplies could arrive, no messages could be sent. The only communication with the outside world was what the besiegers permitted. The city's granaries were full, enough food to last for months, perhaps a year. The cisterns held water, but there would be no reinforcements, no relief force, no hope of rescue. On the causeway, construction had reached the 750-meter mark. Only 50 meters of water separated the mole from the island. Workers could see individual faces on the Tyrian walls. Defenders could count the Macedonian soldiers preparing for the final assault. The siege was entering its decisive phase. Alexander brought up his siege engines. The towers destroyed in the fireship attack had been rebuilt, but now they would advance by ship, not by causeway. 2 of the massive structures were loaded onto transport vessels, floating siege platforms that could be positioned anywhere along the island's perimeter. These towers bristled with artillery, catapults that could throw stones weighing 60 pounds, ballistae that could shoot bolts clean through a man at 300 meters. The bombardment of Tyre's walls began in earnest. Day and night, stones crashed against the fortifications. The Tyrians had built their walls to withstand assault, but they had never faced artillery of this magnitude. Ancient stone, mortared centuries ago, began to crack under the repeated impacts. Merlins along the ramparts were smashed flat. Towers that had stood for generations developed fissures. The Tyrians fought back with their own artillery, firing from the walls at the siege engines. Several Macedonian ships were hit and damaged, but for every catapult on the walls, Alexander had 5 on his ships and towers. The mathematics of attrition favored the besiegers. By late June, after 5 months of siege, the causeway was complete. 800 meters of earth and stone connected the mainland to the island of Tyre. Alexander's army could now march directly to the enemy's walls. The impossible had been achieved. But the walls themselves remained intact. 45 meters of stone blocked the path to victory. The causeway delivered the army to the fortress, but the fortress had yet to fall. The completion of the causeway in late June marked the end of one phase of the siege and the beginning of something far more brutal. Alexander now stood at the gates of Tyre, but those gates were protected by walls that had never been breached in the city's entire history. The Tyrians had used the months of construction to prepare their defenses, and what awaited the Macedonians was a fortress transformed into a death trap. The walls facing the causeway had been reinforced. The Tyrians had piled additional stone and rubble behind the original fortifications, creating walls within walls. They had constructed wooden hoardings along the top of the ramparts, enclosed platforms from which defenders could rain death on attackers while remaining protected from missiles. Catapults and ballistae were positioned at every strategic point. The Tyrians had even heated sand in large metal containers, ready to pour onto anyone who approached. Sand heated to extreme temperatures would slip through armor and burn flesh to the bone, an agonizing death that could not be stopped by any protection. Alexander brought his siege engines to bear. The floating towers were positioned on both flanks of the island, northern and southern sides where the walls were slightly lower. From these platforms, Macedonian artillery commenced systematic bombardment. The strategy was to weaken the fortifications through sustained fire, searching for weak points that could be exploited. At the head of the causeway, more engines were deployed. Battering rams, massive constructions of iron-headed beams suspended on chains within protective wooden frames, were wheeled forward. These rams weighed several tons each, requiring dozens of men to operate. The protective frames were covered in wet hides and metal plates to resist fire. When the ram crews began their work, the rhythmic thunder of iron striking stone became the constant soundtrack of the siege. The Tyrians responded with everything they had. Arrows fell in clouds so thick they darkened the sky. Spears, javelins, stones, pots of burning oil, everything imaginable was hurled from the walls. Macedonian soldiers advancing the siege engines did so under shields, forming testudos, overlapping shield formations that provided protection from above. But the Tyrian artillery was devastatingly accurate. Catapult stones weighing 40 or 50 pounds would crash into shield formations, killing multiple men with a single impact. Bodies piled at the base of the walls. The rams began to have an effect. Ancient mortar, subjected to months of bombardment, started to crumble. Stones loosened in their settings. The Tyrians countered by dropping massive boulders directly onto the rams, attempting to smash the siege engines themselves. Nets woven from ropes were lowered from the walls, designed to catch the ram heads and deflect their force. Macedonian engineers responded with scythes mounted on poles, cutting the nets away. It became a contest of engineering and counter-engineering, each side adapting to the other's innovations. When the Tyrians dropped rocks to protect sections of wall, Alexander's crews would shift their rams to different positions. When defenders concentrated their fire on one siege engine, others would advance. The Macedonians were grinding down the defenses through sheer persistence, but progress was measured in meters and purchased with blood. After 2 weeks of continuous assault on the landward side, only minor breaches had been achieved, none large enough for an assault force to exploit. The Tyrian walls were proving as formidable as their reputation suggested. Alexander recognized that battering through the main fortifications could take months more, time he did not have. The campaigning season was advancing. Autumn storms would soon make operations difficult. He needed a different approach. Alexander ordered a comprehensive reconnaissance of the entire island perimeter. Ships equipped with divers were sent around Tyre, examining every meter of the walls. The crews were searching for weaknesses, sections where foundations might be vulnerable or fortifications less substantial. The divers, working in shifts, probed the underwater portions of the walls, looking for any flaw. They found one. On the southern side of the island, facing the open sea, a section of wall sat on a rocky shelf rather than solid bedrock. The foundations here were shallower, the mortar more exposed to wave action. Centuries of seawater had eroded the binding materials. The wall here was still 40 meters high, still formidable, but the base was compromised. Alexander redirected his main effort. The floating siege towers were concentrated on the southern approach. More rams were constructed and mounted on ships. These naval rams would attack from the sea, something the Tyrian defenses had not been designed to withstand. The walls faced expected assault from the causeway to the north. Fortifications on the southern side, though still powerful, had received less recent reinforcement. The assault intensified. Ships carrying rams approached as close to the walls as the rocky shallows permitted. The rams swung, iron heads smashing into stone 15 feet above the waterline. Spray from the waves mixed with dust from pulverized rock. Tyrian defenders on this section of wall found themselves facing attacks they had not anticipated. They rushed artillery to the southern ramparts, but repositioning heavy catapults takes time, and the Macedonians were not granting them time. A crack appeared in the wall. Not a collapse, not yet, but a visible fissure running vertically for 10 meters. Macedonian crews concentrated their fire on this weak point. Ram after ram struck the same section. Catapult stones from the towers hammered the area around the crack. The fissure widened, became a gap, and suddenly stones were falling away. The breach was not large, perhaps 3 meters wide at the base, but it was enough. Alexander ordered an immediate assault. Marines boarded landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder, shields raised. The boats pushed toward the breach as Tyrian fire intensified. Arrows and javelins struck shields with the sound of hail on wooden roofs. Men fell, tumbled into the sea, were replaced by others pressing forward. The first wave reached the breach and attempted to climb through. They met a wall of Tyrian defenders, men fighting with the desperation of those protecting their homes and families. Spears thrust into the narrow opening. The confined space negated Macedonian advantages in formation fighting. Individual combat, brutal and close, determined who lived and who died. The first assault was repelled, Macedonian bodies piling in the breach, making the footing treacherous for those who followed. Alexander had anticipated this. A breach was useless if it could not be held. He ordered the naval rams to continue working, widening the gap. Simultaneously, assault teams hit multiple points along the walls. Scaling ladders were thrown up against sections where artillery had damaged the parapets. These were diversionary attacks, intended to divide the Tyrian defenders, but they were pressed with full commitment. Men climbed the ladders knowing most would die before reaching the top, climbing anyway because Alexander had made it clear that Tyre would fall, and those who fought hardest would be rewarded. The southern breach widened to 5 meters, then 8. Enough space for a formed unit to enter. Alexander personally led the Hypaspists, his elite guard infantry, into the boats. These were the best soldiers in the Macedonian army, veterans who had fought beside their king from the Danube to the Persian gates. They rowed to the breach under fire, Alexander standing in the lead boat, visible to every man on both sides. The Tyrians recognized him. Missiles concentrated on his position. An arrow struck his shield. A javelin passed so close to his head that he felt the wind of its passage. He did not flinch, did not take cover. His presence steadied the entire assault force. If the king could stand exposed to enemy fire, what soldier could show less courage? The Hypaspists hit the breach and pushed through. Alexander was among the first into the city, shield high, sword drawn. The fighting in the breach was beyond brutal. Men could not swing weapons properly in the confined space. They stabbed with short swords and daggers, grappled hand to hand, bit and clawed when weapons were lost. The stones underfoot were slick with blood. Bodies, both Macedonian and Tyrian, created obstacles that had to be climbed over to advance. But the Hypaspists were the finest close-quarters fighters in the world. Meter by meter, they widened the breach from inside, cutting down defenders, pushing deeper into the city. More Macedonian troops poured through behind them. The breach had become a corridor of death, but it was open. Simultaneously, the diversionary attacks succeeded beyond expectation. On the northern side, a scaling team managed to reach the top of the wall where bombardment had destroyed a section of parapet. A handful of men gained the rampart, held against counterattacks, and created enough space for others to follow. Within minutes, 100 Macedonians stood atop the northern wall. They fought along the ramparts toward the gate towers. Tyrian defenders fell back, unable to contain the assault. When the Macedonians reached the gate mechanisms, they slaughtered the guards and began working the great bronze wheels that controlled the gates. Chains rattled. Massive wooden doors began to swing open. The main Macedonian force, waiting on the causeway, surged forward. Thousands of soldiers who had spent 7 months building, dying, and watching their comrades die, now had an open path into the city. They poured through the gates in a flood of bronze and fury. Tyre's streets became killing zones. The city that had never fallen was now penetrated from 3 directions: the southern breach, the northern gates, and teams that had scaled the walls at multiple points. But the Tyrians did not surrender. They fell back into the narrow streets and continued fighting. Every house became a fortress. Every intersection was contested. Mothers threw stones from rooftops. Old men fought with kitchen knives. The Tyrians knew what awaited them if they lost. Ancient convention held that a city taken by storm could be dealt with as the conqueror wished. Surrender meant possible mercy. Defeat after resistance meant no mercy at all. The Macedonians showed none. 7 months of siege had created a fury that now found release. Soldiers who had watched friends burn in the fireship attack, who had labored under the Mediterranean sun hauling stones, who had endured constant danger and mockery from the walls. They wanted blood. Alexander's officers tried to maintain discipline, but in the chaos of urban combat, control was impossible. The slaughter spread through the city. Tyrian defenders fought to the death because they knew death was coming regardless. The combat was house to house, room to room. Macedonian soldiers kicked in doors and killed everyone inside. The streets ran red. Bodies piled so thick in some alleys that passage was blocked. A group of Tyrian nobles and citizens, perhaps 2,000 people, had fled to the temple of Melkart, the same temple where Alexander had wanted to make sacrifice 7 months earlier. Ancient tradition held that those who took sanctuary in a temple were protected by divine law. The refugees huddled inside, praying to their god, hoping the Macedonians would honor the old customs. Alexander, when informed of the group in the temple, gave orders that they were not to be harmed. Whether this was genuine respect for religious sanctuary or a calculated political decision is unknowable. But the order was obeyed. The temple refugees survived. Elsewhere in the city, no such mercy existed. The Macedonian rampage continued into the night. By morning of the second day, organized resistance had ended. Tyre had fallen. The city that had defied Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years had lasted 7 months against Alexander. The human cost was staggering. 8,000 Tyrian defenders died in the fighting. These were not just soldiers, but any man capable of bearing arms, from teenagers to grandfathers, all killed in the desperate house-to-house combat. The Macedonian losses are not precisely recorded, but ancient sources suggest around 400 killed, with thousands more wounded. Given the intensity of the final assault, the numbers were probably higher. But the dying was not finished. The real horror came in what followed the city's fall. Alexander's rage at the length of the siege, at the defiance he had endured, demanded satisfaction. The price of resistance would be made unmistakably clear. The fall of Tyre on a summer day in 332 before Christ marked one of the most complete military victories in ancient history, but also one of the most terrible in its aftermath. What happened in the days following the final assault would echo through history as a warning of what awaited cities that resisted Alexander the Great. 8,000 Tyrians had died during the fighting, their bodies scattered through the streets and piled in the breaches where the Macedonians had entered. But approximately 32,000 people remained alive in the city when the killing finally stopped. These were women, children, elderly, and those men who had survived the combat by hiding or surrendering once resistance became impossible. Alexander's decision regarding their fate was swift and merciless. All 30,000 were to be sold as slaves. Every single person who had not taken refuge in the Temple of Melkart would be dragged to the auction blocks. Families were separated. Children were torn from mothers. The entire population of one of the ancient world's greatest cities was scattered across the Mediterranean as human property, sold to the highest bidders to work in mines, fields, and brothels until they died. The slave markets were overwhelmed. 30,000 prisoners flooding the system at once drove prices down dramatically. Dealers from across the region converged on Tyre, recognizing the opportunity. Phoenician slaves were valuable. Many were literate, skilled in crafts and navigation. But the sheer numbers meant that people sold for a fraction of their normal worth. Some sources suggest that healthy adults went for as little as the price of a goat. The logistics of processing 30,000 prisoners required days. They were held in makeshift pens, guarded by Macedonian soldiers, while the sales were organized. During this time, conditions were horrific. Limited food, no shelter. Prisoners packed together under the summer sun. Children died of dehydration. The elderly collapsed. Bodies were dragged away and burned. But the slave sales were not the end of Alexander's vengeance. 2,000 Tyrian men, those identified as having been of military age and capable of bearing arms, received a different fate. They were to be crucified. Crucifixion was among the most agonizing deaths the ancient world had devised. The condemned were nailed or tied to wooden crosses and left to die slowly, sometimes taking days. Death came from exhaustion, exposure, and eventually suffocation, as the body's weight made breathing impossible. It was a death designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to display the broken body as a warning to others. 2,000 crosses were erected along the beach where Alexander's army had first camped 7 months earlier. The executions were carried out in groups, dozens at a time. Macedonian soldiers nailed the condemned to the crossbeams, then raised the crosses upright. The screams of the dying filled the air for days. The crosses stretched for miles along the coastline, a forest of human suffering visible from the sea. This was not combat. This was not even massacre in the heat of battle. This was calculated terror, a deliberate message sent to every city between Tyre and the edges of Alexander's expanding empire. Resist, and this is your fate. Not just defeat, not just conquest, but obliteration. Your men crucified, your families enslaved, your city destroyed. The 2,000 dying on crosses represented every family in Tyre. Fathers, sons, brothers, cousins. The women and children being processed for slavery could see the crosses from where they were held. They could hear the screams. They knew those dying men. The psychological trauma was as deliberate as the physical punishment. Ancient sources disagree on the exact timeline, but the crucifixions likely took place over a week. As men died, their bodies were left on the crosses to rot, food for carrion birds. The stench became overwhelming. Ships passing along the coast could smell the decay from miles away. That too was intentional. The message had to spread far and wide. The temple of Melkart refugees, those 2,000 who had sought sanctuary, were indeed spared as Alexander had ordered. But they emerged from the temple to find their city transformed into a charnel house. Everyone they knew was either dead, dying on a cross, or enslaved. The temple survivors were allowed to remain in Tyre, but they lived in a ghost city, surrounded by ruins and memories of those who had been destroyed. Alexander's treatment of Tyre raises questions that historians have debated for over 2,000 years. Was this the action of a military genius imposing necessary discipline, or a young conqueror revealing a capacity for cruelty that would grow darker as his campaigns continued? Ancient sources present conflicting views. Arrian, writing centuries later but using contemporary accounts, suggests the severity was justified by the length and cost of the siege. The Tyrians had killed Macedonian soldiers, had burned siege equipment, had forced Alexander to spend 7 months on a single city when he could have been conquering Egypt and Babylon. The punishment was harsh but proportional to the offense in the context of ancient warfare. Plutarch, more critical of Alexander, presents the massacres as evidence of growing megalomania. The young king, who had wept at the ruins of Troy and shown mercy to Persian royal captives, was becoming something darker. The Siege of Tyre marked a turning point, a moment when Alexander's ambition began consuming his humanity. The reality likely lies between these interpretations. Ancient warfare operated under different moral frameworks than modern conflict. Cities that resisted and fell by storm expected no mercy. This was understood by both attackers and defenders. The Tyrians knew the risks when they refused Alexander's initial request. They chose defiance, gambled on their defenses holding, and lost catastrophically. But even by ancient standards, the scale of Alexander's vengeance was exceptional. 2,000 crucifixions was not normal practice. Most conquering armies executed ringleaders, perhaps a few hundred prominent resistors. Enslaving an entire population was within convention, but the systematic nature of the punishment, the deliberate display of suffering, suggested something beyond military necessity. The psychological impact on Alexander's army must be considered as well. 7 months of brutal siege warfare changes men. The Macedonians who entered Tyre were not the same soldiers who had stood on the beach in January. They had watched friends die building the causeway. They had endured constant danger, mockery, and frustration. When the city finally fell, that accumulated rage found release. Alexander may have ordered the crucifixions, but his soldiers carried them out with enthusiasm born of months of hatred. The transformation of Tyre itself completed the conquest. The causeway that Alexander had built was never removed. Over the following years and centuries, sand and sediment accumulated around it. The channel filled in. Tyre ceased to be an island and became a peninsula, physically connected to the mainland. The geography that had protected the city for 2,000 years was permanently altered by 7 months of human determination. The city was eventually rebuilt and repopulated, though it never regained its former prominence. New Tyre became a Hellenistic city, Greek in culture and administration. The Phoenician traditions that had defined the city for millennia faded. The purple dye industry continued, the harbors were repaired, trade resumed. But the soul of ancient Tyre, the proud independence that had defied Babylon and Persia, was broken forever. Word of Tyre's fate spread faster than Alexander's army could march. Cities throughout the region faced a simple calculation: submit immediately and be treated as allies, receiving relatively generous terms, or resist and risk total destruction. The choice was obvious. As Alexander marched south toward Egypt, city after city opened its gates without opposition. Gaza, the last significant fortress before Egypt, chose to resist and was utterly destroyed, its population killed or enslaved. Egypt itself welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. The Persian satrap surrendered without a fight. Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, visited the oracle at Siwa, and founded the city of Alexandria. Not a single battle was fought because every Egyptian administrator had heard what happened to those who resisted. The Siege of Tyre had served its strategic purpose. Alexander controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. The Persian fleet, without bases or support, disintegrated. Darius could not threaten Greece or Alexander's supply lines. The path to Mesopotamia and the heart of the Persian Empire lay open. But the cost in human suffering, in lives destroyed and families shattered, in crucifixions and slavery, that cost was paid by people whose only crime was loyalty to their city. The 30,000 slaves scattered across the ancient world, the 2,000 bodies rotting on crosses, they were the price of Alexander's strategic victory. The Siege of Tyre stands as one of the most remarkable military achievements in human history, not for a single battle won or an army defeated, but for the sheer audacity of attempting what every military mind of the age considered impossible. Alexander did not simply conquer a city, he conquered geography itself, transforming sea into land through will and engineering. The causeway remains to this day. Walk the streets of modern Tyre in Lebanon, and you walk on the ruins of Alexander's construction, buried under 23 centuries of accumulated sediment and urban development. The island that defied empires is now a peninsula, permanently joined to the mainland by the consequences of a 7-month siege in 332 before Christ. Few military campaigns have literally reshaped the physical world. This one did. From a purely military perspective, the siege demonstrated capabilities that would not be matched for centuries. The engineering required to build an 800-meter causeway in open water under enemy fire without modern equipment or materials represented a triumph of logistics and organization. Alexander coordinated the efforts of tens of thousands of workers, managed supply lines stretching across multiple regions, and solved technical problems that would challenge engineers today. The naval campaign showed equal brilliance. Alexander had no fleet at the beginning of the siege, yet within months he assembled over 200 warships and defeated an enemy that had controlled Mediterranean waters for generations. He did this not through shipbuilding, which would have taken years, but through diplomacy and strategic reasoning. Convinced the Phoenician cities that Persia was finished and their fleets would follow. Simple in concept, but it required accurate assessment of political realities and the credibility to make his promises believable. The tactical innovations were equally significant. Floating siege towers, naval battering rams, coordinated assaults from multiple directions. These were not standard practices in ancient warfare. Alexander and his engineers invented solutions as the siege progressed, adapting to each Tyrian countermeasure. The willingness to completely change strategy, to redirect the main assault from the causeway to the southern walls when the original approach proved too costly, demonstrated flexibility that many commanders lack. But military genius cannot be separated from the human cost it produces. 8,000 defenders killed, 30,000 enslaved, 2,000 crucified. These numbers represent individual human beings, each with names, families, hopes, and dreams that ended in violence or bondage. The genius that built the causeway also ordered the crucifixions. The determination that overcame impossible obstacles also created forests of crosses along the beach. Ancient historians who wrote closer to the events often justified the severity as necessary. Diodorus Siculus argued that Alexander had to make an example of Tyre to prevent other cities from resisting. If Tyre had held out longer, or if Alexander had eventually withdrawn, every fortress from Syria to India would have believed they too could defy him. The empire he was building required the perception of invincibility. Mercy to a city that had cost him 7 months would have been strategic weakness. Modern perspectives struggle with this logic. We live in an age where international law attempts to restrain the conduct of warfare, where intentionally targeting civilians is considered criminal. Judging Alexander by modern standards produces obvious conclusions about war crimes and atrocities. But judging him by ancient standards, by the norms of his time and the expectations of his contemporaries, creates more complex assessments. The real legacy of Tyre lies in what it revealed about Alexander himself. This was a man who would not accept defeat. When his siege towers burned, he built new ones. When his causeway was destroyed, he rebuilt it wider. When he lacked ships, he created a fleet from nothing. The word impossible did not exist in his vocabulary. This trait drove him to achieve things no other commander had accomplished. But it also drove him to extremes of cruelty when his will was thwarted. The 7 months at Tyre changed Alexander. He had begun the siege as a young king still proving himself, still conscious of his youth and the skepticism of older commanders. He ended it as an emperor who would tolerate no defiance. The pattern established at Tyre repeated throughout his campaigns. Cities that submitted were treated well. Cities that resisted faced annihilation. Gaza, which resisted after Tyre, was completely destroyed. Persepolis, the Persian capital, was burned. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. Yet we must also acknowledge the alternative outcomes. If Alexander had withdrawn from Tyre, if he had accepted that some fortresses were too strong to take, his entire campaign might have collapsed. The Persian fleet would have continued operating from Tyrian bases, threatening his supply lines and supporting rebellions in Greece. His reputation as an invincible conqueror would have been shattered. Every subsequent siege would have been harder because defenders would know he could be stopped. The causeway itself became a model for future military engineering. Roman generals studied the Siege of Tyre when planning their own operations. Julius Caesar's siege works at Alesia, where he built fortifications in a complete circle around a Gallic stronghold, drew inspiration from Alexandrian methods. The concept of overwhelming obstacles through engineering, rather than accepting them as limits, influenced Western military thinking for centuries. The psychological warfare aspects also became doctrine. The message Alexander sent with those 2,000 crosses was received throughout the ancient world. When his successors built their own empires after his death, they employed similar tactics. The Hellenistic kingdoms that divided Alexander's conquests All understood that mercy shown to early resistors encouraged further resistance. Brutality toward the first few rebellions prevented dozens more. Tyre also marked the moment when Alexander's campaign transformed from a war of revenge against Persia into something larger. Philip II had dreamed of punishing the Persians for invading Greece a century and a half earlier. Alexander had fulfilled that mission by defeating Darius at Issus. Everything after Tyre was conquest for its own sake, the building of an empire that would stretch from Greece to India, encompassing more territory than any previous ruler had controlled. The citizens of Tyre who died on crosses or spent their lives in slavery could not have understood this larger historical context. To them, Alexander was simply a destroyer, a foreign invader who had shattered their world. Their perspective matters. History is written by victors, and Alexander's victories ensured that ancient sources present him as a hero. But to the Tyrians, to the families torn apart and sold across the Mediterranean, he was a monster. Both perspectives contain truth. Alexander was a military genius whose innovations changed warfare. He was also a conqueror whose ambitions produced massive human suffering. These facts coexist. We can admire the engineering brilliance of the causeway while recognizing the horror of what followed its completion. The Siege of Tyre demonstrates the complex relationship between human achievement and human cruelty. The same determination that accomplishes the impossible can also justify the inexcusable. The same strategic vision that builds empires also fills slave markets and erects forests of crosses. Greatness in one dimension does not require or excuse morality in another. Standing today on the peninsula of Tyre, looking at the water that once separated the island from the mainland, we witness the physical manifestation of will overcoming nature. Alexander wanted to reach that island, and so the island ceased to be an island. 23 centuries later, his construction project remains, outlasting his empire, outlasting the civilizations that followed. A permanent monument to what humans can achieve when they refuse to accept limitations. But beneath that causeway, beneath the accumulated sediment and modern construction, lie the bones of workers who died building it. Scattered across the Mediterranean in unmarked graves are 30,000 people who were enslaved because their city stood in the path of ambition. These too are part of the legacy, part of the true cost of the achievement. The question the Siege of Tyre poses is not whether Alexander was great. By any military standard, he clearly was. The question is whether greatness measured in conquered territory and engineering marvels is worth the price paid by those who were conquered and enslaved. History cannot answer that question. Each person must decide for themselves what weight to give military genius versus human suffering, strategic necessity versus moral cost. What remains undeniable is that in 7 months on the coast of Phoenicia, a 24-year-old king accomplished something no one believed possible. He built a road across the sea. He conquered the unconquerable, and in doing so, he demonstrated both the highest capabilities of human achievement and the darkest capacities of human nature. Both legacies endure, inseparable, carved into the very landscape of Tyre.